to the digital space or die. Well, with that said, we move on swiftly into matters mobilizing long-term capital. The financial sector deepening Kenya, that is FSD, is looking to mobilize long-term capital for sustainable development within the country. Our reporter Jasmine Murani attended the FSD Africa Roundtable on capital markets and now joins us live.
Yes, indeed, Noah. Different stakeholders in the financial sector have convened here today, courtesy of FSD Africa. The theme for this year's roundtable is mobilizing capital for long-term sustainable development here in Kenya. And of course, in that regard, I am joined by Mark Napier from FSD Africa just to talk to us about a few things in relation to this theme. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So our first question in that regard would be, the government of Kenya has been struggling to raise revenue from local markets. As FSD, what is your outlook on that?
So FSD Africa's role is to support the development of financial markets in general. There's a lot of work that we can all do to improve the ecosystem to allow investment to flow, and that will benefit private projects, but it will also benefit the government when financial markets are basically deeper and more efficient.
And how can the private sector come in to help the government in sealing the revenue loopholes that have been there in terms of them trying to access revenue from the local market?
The debt situation in Kenya means that the government is going to not be in a position to be able to fund development and investment as much as it has been able to in the past. And so in order to sustain momentum around economic growth, we need to look at different ways that we can introduce private sector capital to support the continuing growth of the economy. And that means having different arrangements between the private sector and government than existed before. So historically, I think we've always expected government to pick up the bill. That's not going to be possible in the future. And so I think through creative public-private arrangements, I think we can encourage the private sector to come in and support the development of new projects which the government simply isn't in a position to be able to fund at the moment. I think we can do that. I think there are lots of opportunities to do that, but we do need to get much more creative about in the way that we structure financial projects and financial structures in order to crowd that capital in. So I think we can do that. I think the government can still play a role in taking away some of that initial risk for the private sector. But that's a tried and tested approach for governments to adopt all around the world. So it's not revolutionary to do that. But I think it requires a little bit of a mindset change on the part of governments to say, okay, so we can't do everything that we used to be able to do. We can now look to the private sector to fund that.
And when you talk about opportunities for the private sector to come in and help the government in that regard, what opportunities are this, and what can the private sector jump on?
So we're at FSD Africa, we're very focused on climate investment, on climate finance and boosting for more capital in all sorts of parts of the green economy. Clearly, there's a lot of excitement in Kenya around renewable energy and the potential for renewable energy. We need a lot more renewable energy, and we need also to have a lot more capital going into access to renewable energy as well. So that we see as a major opportunity. And of course, renewable energy is a massive multiplier for the rest of the economy. So the more, and I think that's interesting to the private sector as well, because the private sector understands about renewable energy. There are more difficult sectors or newer sectors in the green economy, for example, electric vehicles, where I think more donor or government support is going to be needed, because these are sort of asset classes or new industries which investors are less familiar with. But electric vehicles, agriculture, perhaps even nature-based solutions. Some of those things are also really interesting potentially to the private sector as well.
And how is the uptake looking? When you talk about things like green bonds, how is that being taken up in the Kenyan market?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think we can all agree that the progress of the green bond market in Kenya has been quite slow. I think part of the reason for that is that the Kenyan government itself has not issued a green bond. It's in a position to be able to do that in theory. It's done a lot of the groundwork for it. And once governments start to issue green bonds, the private sector at least starts to see a benchmark, and you will start to see deal flow following. But it will happen. I'm sure it will happen. There's something very attractive about a green bond where investors know that what they're getting into is a financial instrument that is dedicated towards green objectives and where the projects are pre-identified. So there's a strong accountability benefit to green bonds. So I think it will come, but it's been slow up until now.
And when we talk about the future as FSD Africa, what does that look like for you?
So the future for us, I think, is really of a sustainable financial market in which the private sector plays a much, much bigger role than has been the case up until now. The key to all of this is innovation. So financial markets need a lot of innovation. One of the really interesting points to come out of today's meeting was just how little capital has been raised on the public capital markets. On the Nairobi Securities Exchange, there's been very, very little capital raised, almost nothing for the last few years. So that means that the private sector, the private capital providers need to get much more innovative about providing capital to the projects that need it. So our vision is really one, and it's possible, it's very achievable. Our vision is one in which the public capital markets and private capital markets are all innovating together, where you have a supportive ecosystem where the government is very interested in supporting private capital, and where Kenya starts to then become the kind of hub for both domestic capital providers, especially on climate finance, but also for international providers too.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we had time for here at Sankara, where we have been convening thanks to FSD. Back to you in studio, Noah.
Thank you very much, Jasmine Murani, with the latest from Martyrs Mobilization of